It's nice. It's nice to be able to come out and speak to people. When the book came out, Savas Beatty, my publisher, set up a series of meetings and events. Let's go back one. There we go. And a lot of them were virtual because that's where we are now. A lot of roundtables particularly like to hear Civil War talks. Obvious Civil War roundtables like to hear these Civil War talks. And with the pandemic and everyone learning how to use Zoom or Meets, you can zoom into a meeting tonight that's in Los Angeles, here in Virginia. I have spoken to groups in Seattle, in Louisiana, Richmond, and I got one coming up in Miami next year. So it opens up the opportunity for a speaker, a public speaker with the Civil War, to just a lot of people across the country. So we're going to talk about The Carnage Was Fearful tonight. That's Battle of Cedar Mountain. The title, The Carnage Was Fearful, comes from a line in one of the reports of the battle. This is my disclaimer. I was not at the Battle of Cedar Mountain. Some of my grandchildren think I might have been. Some of the people I used to work with me think I was. So what we have is what we have from the participants in their letters, their diaries, their reports, their post-war memoirs. And everybody has an opinion and a thought and an agenda when you do those kind of things. And so you got to take that for granted when you're doing this kind of work. Cedar Mountain. Here's the two main protagonists. Stonewall Jackson, of course, in his last campaign as an independent commander after Cedar Mountain, he will never again be a part of an independent command. He's always going to be part of Robert E. Lee after that. And on the other side is the Army of Virginia commander, John Pope. John is, I love this photo of John because that's from his Egyptian stage. Kind of looks like he's coming out with the pharaohs there. The battle was fought really amongst brigade commanders. And I want to show you just the key brigade commanders who were here from both sides. And the first one is the 9th Corps commander, Nathaniel Banks, and his brigade, his division commanders and brigade commanders down below. And some people have looked at it kind of strange. This is not the finalists in the Army of Virginia facial hair competition, but they all could be. These are the guys that participated in this fight for the Federals. There's only 9,000 Federals on the field at Cedar Mountain. Stonewall Jackson is going to bring 22,000 with him that day. So there's the spoiler alert. We know how this is going to turn out for both sides. There's 3 divisions of Confederates on the field this day. The first 2 are led by Charles Winder. See if this is working. There's Charles Winder and Richard Ewell. And each of them had 3 brigades with them. We don't even have a picture of Charles Ronald. This is the only time during the war that he is going to lead a brigade in action. He's leading the Stonewall Brigade, the famous Stonewall Brigade. And 3 weeks later at the Battle of Second Manassas, he is just not present. Stonewall Jackson has got rid of him. The other interesting guy is Thomas Stewart Garnett up here. Whoop, back wrong way. Thomas Stewart Garnett, that's him right there. We can't find a picture of him either, but I found a painting in a courthouse in King George County. And so that's where he is from. And the rest of the Confederates here were, of course, led by Ambrose Powell Hill, a Culpeper native. He had 7 brigades. 6 were actually present at the battle. 1 wasn't. Massey Gregg's brigade of South Carolinians. They were left to defend the ford at Barnett's Ford. So they didn't get a chance to play in this fight. So those are the key people that are at this battle. What I'd like to do is kind of give you an idea of where everybody is at the start of this campaign. In mid-July, Lee has pushed McClellan back down to Harrison's Lane, and the 7 days campaign is over. McClellan is bottled up. Lee is actually concerned about Ambrose Burnside and where he's going. Believe it or not, Lee was being kept awake by Ambrose Burnside. Burnside with 2 divisions coming up from South and North Carolina. Where he's going to land is going to be critical to what Lee does with his strategy going forward. If he reinforces McClellan, McClellan could reinitiate the campaign against the front door of Richmond. If Burnside continues up the river, he could go to Petersburg or the Bermuda Hundred area and start initiating a campaign from the south, forcing Lee to fight a two-front battle, which is something he didn't want to do in the spring of '62, and he doesn't want to do it again. Burnside could continue up to the Fredericksburg area and then start moving south from there, and again forcing Lee into a two-front fight. On top of that, John Pope has been named the commander of the Army of the Virginia, and his three corps under Sigel, Banks, and McDowell with Ricketts and King are scattered across northern Virginia. Lee's got to contain McClellan, figure out where Burnside's going, and then deal with Pope when he finally starts moving. What he does is he detaches Stonewall Jackson from his army and sends him to Louisa Courthouse. That's about where Louisa Courthouse is on there. It's on the Virginia Central Railroad, and it's Lee's intention to keep an eye on Pope, put a force out there just in case, and then if the opportunity presents itself, Jackson can either go forward after Pope or move back to Richmond to defend against Richmond if the situation warrants. Fortunately for Lee, Burnside is going to land at Fort Monroe and eventually go up to Aquia after the Battle of Cedar Mountain, so he's not going to play a role in this campaign at all. Pope's got a plan. He is, as he comes east in late June and takes over command of the Army of Virginia, Lincoln keeps him in D.C. because Lincoln knows John Pope. John Pope came east on the inaugural train with Lincoln. He's a Republican. He likes the way Pope thinks. McClellan is a Democrat. Lincoln is tired of the way that war is being prosecuted that way. So things are going to change with the war. And so he wants to keep McClellan or Pope in Washington so he can coordinate with him and communicate and get a fuller understanding of exactly what's going on in this theater of war. Pope is kept almost at Lincoln's hip during the month of July because McClellan is sending messages up and telegrams up to D.C. explaining what he's doing, and Pope is interpreting for Lincoln. And so for the first month of his leadership in the Army of Virginia, Pope is in D.C. while his army is scattered across Sperryville, Little Washington, Waterloo, and down in the Fredericksburg area. Pope's got multiple tasks. He's got to keep that line of communication up between Aquia, because that's where they believe McClellan is going to eventually land once he leaves Harrison's Landing. He's got to protect Washington. Every general has to protect Washington, and he's also got to keep the Shenandoah Valley open for communications for him. He gets orders to advance to Culpeper and then maneuver Jackson or any forces away from Gordonsville, Charlottesville, and the James River, eventually, hopefully, moving into the back door of Richmond, again, forcing Lee to fight on two fronts. Jackson's orders are simple. Protect that rail line at Gordonsville. Gordonsville is where the Virginia Central and the Orange and Alexandria come together. During the war, it is the second largest rail yard in the state. It's got the industry there, it's got the support infrastructure, and most importantly, all the foodstuffs from the valley must pass through Gordonsville. If Gordonsville is lost, Lee's army and Richmond possibly could starve. And Lee just can't have that. And so Jackson's role is to protect that rail junction at Gordonsville. And if the opportunity presents itself, he wants Pope suppressed. In other words, I'd like to say, give Pope a punch in the nose, change the initiative, force Pope back. But don't stray too far away, because I may need you in front of Richmond again. And so those are Jackson's orders. Early part of August, Jackson is reinforced with a division, A.P. Hill's division. Hill and another general by the name of James Longstreet got into a tough tiss over some newspaper articles. They started not speaking to each other and exchanging nasty letters, and it got to the point where James Longstreet and A.P. Hill, two of Lee's most trusted subordinates, are starting to exchange letters in preparation for a duel. Robert E. Lee cannot have that, obviously, and so he detaches Hill and chops him over to Jackson's command, plussing up Jackson's army by over 9,000 men, putting it up to that 22,000 number, gives Jackson that opportunity, an offensive punch, if he can find it, to stop Pope. Pope, on the 7th of August, finally begins to move south from Sperryville and Little Washington into the Culpeper area. Jackson realizes that, and he sees that the only way that the Federals can advance is along a single road, today's modern 522. Ricketts is going to come down the Rixleyville Road, but the bulk of his army is coming down 522. Banks is going to move first, followed by Sigel. That's the plan. Already in Culpeper, since the middle of July, is Samuel Crawford's brigade of infantry. So it's the first time Culpeper has been occupied and kept occupied at the start of the war. There have been some cavalry raids prior to this, but they came and went. This is the first time that there's actually a physical presence in Culpeper, and of course the citizens don't like that. Crawford's mission is to support the cavalry. Oh, wrong way, there we go. Support the cavalry of John Buford and George Bayard, who are operating in Madison and Orange counties, scouting, putting up screens to deflect the Confederates from spying on what the Federals are doing. And Buford and Pope also has a signal station on top of Thoroughfare Mountain, right next to Prince Michel Winery today, that mountain right there. They have a signal station up there that can look down into Orange and actually follow Jackson as he's eventually going to be moving north. So Pope starts moving on the night of the 6th, the morning of the 7th. Jackson gets wind of that. And Jackson, as you may know, is very reluctant to let people know what their orders are, except to go to the next ford, go to the next village. When Jackson issues his orders on the night of the 7th, he has Richard Ewell, who is camped west of town in an area near Foscati, march on Modern 20 into Orange Courthouse, make a turn at the courthouse, and head north towards Barnett's Ford. A.P. Hill and Charles Winder, who are camped south of town, are supposed to follow him. Hill next, and then Winder bringing up the rear. This is Hill's first march with the army of the Valley, Stonewall Jackson's army. After Jackson sends out these orders, he realizes that there's actually a shorter route for Pope, or for Ewell, to go up to the Rapidan River and move along there at Liberty Mills and cross at Barnett's Ford. And he sends orders to Ewell to march so. He does not tell Hill. He does not tell Winder. And so Ewell's on his way early in the morning of August 8th, having a good old time. And Hill has his men lined up for his first march with Stonewall Jackson. These two have a history. They didn't get along at West Point, but they're professionals and they're going to work together until today. They're going to work together until today. And as Hill's men are lined up, he starts seeing soldiers marching by in the early morning. The 2nd Brigade goes by, and he realizes at that point that it's not Ewell's division, but it's Charles Winder's. And it's at that point Stonewall Jackson rides up. Stonewall Jackson has a temper. A.P. Hill has a temper. Very few words were said to one another, but the relationship ended between those two right there. The only thing that was crossed between them was orders, yes sir, no sir. So the line of march has changed, and it's the first series of events on a very bad day for Stonewall Jackson and this army moving north. Ewell's division gets up to Barnett's Ford first. Barnett's Ford, dirt on both sides, and as you leave that ford heading north towards the eventual battlefield, that water is going to create just a slick mud pit on the north side of Barnett's Ford, and it's going to slow the whole process down. By the end of the day, Ewell's only going to make it up to Crooked Run Baptist Church, about 5.5 miles from the eventual battlefield. Winder's division, now second in line, has lost their commander for the day. Charles Winder is seriously ill and is confined to a wagon for most of the day, or he's laying under the shade of a tree. He should not be with the army right now. Finally, A.P. Hill, who's already on Jackson's list, gets only a mile out of Orange. That's as far as they march today. It is the absolute worst day of marching in Stonewall Jackson's army during the course of the war. On top of that, the Federal cavalry are skirmishing with them the whole way, forcing those columns to slow down to form out. Yes, question?
Why did they only get a mile out of Orange?
There was a traffic jam. Think of I-95 in that snow we had last winter. Ewell gets through, his division goes through, his artillery and his wagons are behind all that, and just slows the whole process down. Then you have another full division under Charles Winder, his men, his artillery, his wagons behind that, just slowing everything down. It's all those, it's 22,000 guys on a single road, single 2-lane, 1.5-lane road going through a mud pit. There's just no way for them to negotiate that. You know, the Monday morning quarterback says Jackson should have used 2 roads. He didn't. He should have communicated with Hill and Winder, and he didn't. So it was just a bad coordinated event the whole day. On top of the traffic jam, on top of the Federal cavalry, the temperatures are in the 90s. It's been in the mid-90s for 5 days prior to the battle, the day of the battle, and 2 days after. We're in wool carrying up to 40 pounds of gear. Soldiers are literally dying of sunstroke on the road north. Every time there's a pause, soldiers are going to break for shade, and so it's just going to slow the column down that much more. It's just a horrendous day. Jackson, as a matter of fact, is going to say, he's going to write a note to Lee that night, I am not making progress. I am fearful that we will not have any kind of success. But we're still going to go forward and see what we can do. The Federals are going to come into Culpeper Courthouse again along 522. Banks's men are going to spend the night along the Hazel River and march into town and down south towards the battlefield. Franz Sigel up in Sperryville is going to send a note to John Pope saying, hey boss, which road do you want us to take? How many roads are from Sperryville to Culpeper? Yeah. So Pope is probably said a few choice words, colorful words, and sent a note back to Sigel saying, take 522. The other orders that Sigel gets for the day is he's supposed to cook rations for his men so they have food when they get here. Sigel's not going to do that, and when he finally gets into Culpeper on the evening of August 9th, after the battle is almost over, Pope tries to hurry them to the field, and Franz says, no, we can't. We need to eat first. And we didn't cook rations, so we need to stop and cook our rations before we go down to the battlefield. So they stopped and got some food on Davis Street, I guess, or ordered some Grubhub because they just didn't make it to the battlefield. So by the morning of August 9th, Jackson's lead elements is at Crooked Run Baptist Church. Winder's division's in the woods near Woodbury School, and Pope is just about a mile north, or Hill's just about a mile north of town. Ricketts' division, who has come down, we can go back one there. Ricketts' division has come down to Culpeper, is camped at a place called Colvin's Tavern, just north of the battlefield. Crawford is ordered during the day to move down to the eventual site of the battlefield on that ridge along Mitchell Station Road. If you know Mitchell Station Road, that's where Crawford's men are going to camp for the night of August 8th, August 9th. And as I said, Banks is on the Hazel, and Sigel's lost in Sperryville. George Townsend, a reporter for the New York Herald, was in Culpeper when these armies passed through. This is what he wrote. Regiments were pouring in by all the roads and lanes onto the main street, and with a spectacle of thousands of bayonets extending as the eye could reach, was enhanced by the music of a score of bands, throbbing in all the same moment with wild music. St. Patrick's Day intermingled with the weird refrain of Bonnie Dunder. Snatches of German sword songs were drowned out by the thrilling of the Star-Spangled Banner. Suddenly, as if by rehearsal, all the hats would go up, and all the bayonets would toss and glisten, which sounds dangerous to me, and huzzas would deafen the winds, while the horses reared upon their horses and the sabers rose and fell. Then, column by column, the masses passed eastward, while the prisoners in the courthouse cupola looked down and citizens peeped through the fear in the windows. Great shot. This is from August of 1862. And there's those prisoners in the window. And I don't want the ladies to look because that's their underwear they're hanging out drying on the railing up there at the top of the courthouse. After the battle and even before the battle, the courthouse was used as a temporary prison holding area. So both the armies are advancing to contact. On the morning of August 9th, the only thing between these two forces of infantry are 3 regiments of Federal cavalry that are camped along or positioned along what we now know as the Crittenden Farm Lane. The 1st Rhode Island was down near the base of the mountain. The 1st New Jersey was in the fields along and north of or south of the Culpeper Road, and the 1st Pennsylvania is in the woods. And you can read the account from the history of the 1st Pennsylvania there. I love that last paragraph. The same indifferent talking, eating, and drinking was going on that characterizes an ordinary halt. Indeed, at the very moment when a shell was whistling above our heads, the discovery of a rabbit scuttling through the corn created excitement which drew the attention of the men entirely away from the destructive missile. These are boys. These are 18, 19, 20-year-old boys, and a rabbit scooting through the grass, through the corn, is going to have more of an impact than a missile going overhead. They're just young men. While this is going on, Early's brigade is the 1st Brigade up again of Ewell's division, and he has swung out along the road to clear this infantry out. And while that's going on, the rest of Ewell's division under Isaac Trimble and Henry Fourneau are moving north onto a spot that we know today as the shelf of Cedar Mountain. And with him are 6 guns under the command of Joseph Latimer. Those guns are going to get into the position there at the Reverend Slaughterhouse on the shelf, and they're going to raise havoc throughout the day. There's Joe Latimer. I'd like to ask you to think back what you were doing when you were 18 years old. Were you leading a division of artillery into battle? I know I wasn't. That's what Joe's doing. He's almost a VMI graduate. When the war starts, he is sent to Richmond to train the artillerists. He eventually is offered and accepts a commission as a captain in the Virginia Artillery. And on this day, he is the acting chief of artillery for Ewell's division. He's got less than a year to live. He's going to die. He's going to be mortally wounded at Gettysburg. Not bad for an 18-year-old. As the battle begins, the lead division up is Charles Winder because of the mess up with Hill. Charles Winder is a mirror image of Jackson. He doesn't like to share his orders. He also has a problem getting along with his men. One soldier will write that in the next battle, we don't know how he's going to die, but it could come from a Yankee bullet or it could come from one of our bullets. So he is a candidate for friendly fire, fratricide. Well, as he's deploying his men on the field near the Crittenden Gate area, the artillery has moved up position and is starting to exchange fire with the Federals on the other side of the field. He's an old artillerist, and so while he's trying to direct infantry into position, he's also going over and talking to the gunners and working the guns, helping them fire, giving them directions. Not what he's supposed to be doing. He's a division commander, not an artillery battery commander. And it was during one of those times when he's leaning over talking to an artillerist, he leans forward to shout an order, and a shell rips him open right here. Opens up his gut, tears his arm. He is going to be the only general who's going to die, Confederate general who's going to die during the Civil War in Culpeper. He's going to be he's listed as mortally wounded, but he's going to die within an hour, and he's going to remain mostly conscious the full time. This is right as the battle's beginning. So the chain of command, they lose Winder. It goes to a senior brigadier by the name of a gentleman by the name of Tolliver, who again has no idea what the orders are and has to scramble and find his fellow brigades and find Stonewall Jackson and find out what's going on. So everything slows down at this point for the Confederates. The other serious injury, recognize that house? The other serious injury is R. Snowden Andrews. R. Snowden Andrews is a chief of artillery for Winder's guns. And as the fire got so hot at the Crittenden Gate area, they dispersed the guns. Andrews goes forward with the guns to the point today where they are on the Cedar Mountain battlefield, at the top of that little knoll out there, right in the middle of the battlefield, near that location there. And as he's helping getting these guns in place, a piece of shrapnel opens up his stomach. He has the wherewithal to fall from his horse on his back with his hands on his intestines to keep them from falling out. That's how that man survives. 5-foot drop from a horse to the ground. Doctors come up and say, you aren't going to live. To paraphrase, and he says, he hears them say that, and he says, you know, I had a damn dog that lost his intestines and chased a fox across the field. I know I'm better than that dog. And so they say he's got a lot of grit in him and on him. So they will put him in a wagon, evacuate him to Spring Hill. His wife, who's in Baltimore, will come down with a child still breastfeeding and nurse him back to health. He will eventually go back into Confederate service. He's going to be wounded again during the Gettysburg campaign. And they say, okay, you're done. And they send him to Germany to negotiate purchasing of arms and armaments for the Confederates. And while he's over there, some of the German states and Denmark get into a war. And he wants to go check it out. And they say, no, it's too dangerous. And allegedly he opens up his blouse, shows him the scars, and said, really, too dangerous? I don't think so. And he goes and sees the fight. He comes back after the war. He comes back through Canada because he's for a while an unreconstructed rebel. When he does get home in Maryland, he's going to build a wing at the Treasury Department. He's an architect. He's going to build the Maryland State House, and he's going to work on an asylum in Maryland. So pretty much a Renaissance guy. This is the guy who initiates the Battle of Cedar Mountain. Major Henry Palouse. Now, how does this guy do this? On the morning of August 9th, Banks is marching south, and he rides to Pope's headquarters, Henry does, to get the orders on what we're supposed to do today. Lewis Marshall, one of Pope's aides, and Robert E. Lee's nephew, gives him verbal orders, basically saying, find a good defensive position, establish your skirmishers, don't attack. Well, that's not what Henry hears. Henry basically hears, find a good defensive position, advance your skirmishers, and if attacked, you can engage. You can bring this thing on. So, according to Palouse, Banks has marching orders to initiate a battle if he so chooses. Also, there's a brigadier general with Banks that day by the name of Benjamin Roberts, who is Pope's chief of cavalry, and he repeats to Banks numerous times throughout the day, there must be no backing out this day. So Pope's getting it from two different sources that if there's an opportunity, we need to strike. You got to remember Nathaniel Banks' nickname in Jackson's army is Commissary Banks, because Jackson would keep capturing his wagons and taking his food. So Banks has got a chip on his shoulder. And as he looks across this field, as his army is deploying, his 9,000 men, let me repeat that, 9,000 men are deploying, he sees some of Jackson's men up on the shelf out there. He sees Early's brigade down in the valley below. He sees some movement at the Crittenden Gate, and maybe some movement at a place that's going to be called the Point in the trees. Jackson's army scattered. There's big gaps between these lines. If I strike, I can shove them back. Commissary Banks, I'll teach you. So, the skirmishers go out, they engage. Banks engages and starts the Battle of Cedar Mountain. Throughout the day, Banks is going to send messages back to Pope saying, this is what's going on. We're pretty cool here. And Pope, who's camped at the northern side of town out at the Wallach House, which is behind where the Coles and the Wild Wings are today. That's where that house was. Here's scattered fire and a little bit of artillery every now and then. But after 5 o'clock, that crescendo really goes up. And he's still getting messages from Banks saying everything's cool. So something's going on here. Pope gets on his horse, ride down to the battlefield. He's going to get to the battlefield by the time the battle's over. Banks is going to initiate a series of assaults. He wants everyone to advance at once. It does not happen. This is still early in the war. We don't know how to coordinate ourselves yet. And so it's going to become a series of brigade-level attacks throughout the afternoon. And we're going to focus really kind of on the federal side because they're the ones that are initiating this action. And the first to step off is Christopher Augur's division under John Gary and Henry Prince. The 3rd Brigade under George Sears Green is going to be a defensive position. They're not going to do anything. So the 8th and 12th U.S. Infantry Battalions move out. Geary's Ohio Brigades move out using the road as their right, saying, keep your right on the road and we know we'll be going straight where we want to go. The problem is going to be as they advance is that there's a full brigade of Confederate infantry on the road. And it's kind of hard to stay on that road when you don't know they're there and they start showing up and firing into your flank. Geary's also going to be taking fire from Tolliver's brigade that's along the Crittenden farm lane. Prince's men advance behind that, and they advance in a kind of an in echelon position. You can see they're not lined up straight. And those guys are in front, the 111th Pennsylvania and the 3rd Maryland, and behind them the 109th Pennsylvania and the 102nd New York. And as that rear rank steps off, they're reminded, remember, there's guys in front of you to your front right. We got it, boss. Here we go. We're good. Everybody fires their first volley. Then they fire that second volley. They fire it into the backs of the 3rd Maryland. 3rd Maryland says, this is stupid, and we run. The Pennsylvanians right next to them say, well, where are they going? Well, we're going to go too. And then the two ranks behind them see what's going on and say, well, we're going to retreat too. And so Prince's brigade, just as it gets started, stops, breaks, and retreats. Fortunately for Henry Prince, before they stepped off, they said, see this farm lane here? This is where we're going to retreat to and rally and go forward again. And they stop. They have that kind of discipline to stop, and they rally, and they move forward again. They're eventually going to move forward and occupy Early's position on the battlefield and shove Early back about 300 yards for a period of time. And we know who does it. It's the 3rd Maryland, because the Marylanders plant a flag on that position, and they're the only Maryland regiment on the battlefield this day. So we know who did it. So we know that Prince recovered well. Fortunately for Stonewall Jackson and his men, Thomas's Georgians arrive and they secure that right flank of Jackson's, and they start firing into the flank of Prince's guys, and so everything just kind of settles down. In this part of the battlefield, it's practically all corn. While corn looks good and you can hide behind it, it doesn't really stop bullets. And the soldiers realize that as the day goes on. And there's going to be lots of casualties. In the end, Christopher Auger, I don't like this thing tonight. Christopher Auger is going to be wounded. John Geary is going to be wounded. Henry Prince is going to become a prisoner of war. So the leadership in Auger's division is completely shot by the end of the battle. In the middle, and we're going to focus on these guys a lot because these are the guys that come closest to victory for the Federals, is Samuel Crawford. These are the guys that were down here the night before. And as the morning comes, they move from their position back along Mitchell Station Road back here, and they go into the trees on what I like to call Crawford Hill. It doesn't have a name, so I'm calling it Crawford Hill, because that's where he was. They come down out of that hill over a fence into a freshly cut wheat field that slopes down to what is modern Dove Hill Lane. In 1862, it's a dry creek. And then they have to go up a hill to where the Confederate positions are, completely exposed. Crawford has four regiments in his brigade: the 5th Connecticut, the 28th New York, 46th Pennsylvania. His 4th Regiment, the 10th Maine, is being held back as an infantry reserve for Nathaniel Banks. So he goes forward with 3/4 of his men. So he doesn't go forward with full force. He charges across this open field. And there we can see how they advanced. Again, that this creek bed is modern Dove Hill. So if you know that area, that's Dove Hill Road. And then the ground right next to it is where Garnett's men are in that L-shaped. Those guys are having a good old time firing into Geary's men out here in the corn in front of them. Here comes the 5th Connecticut out there down, and they go butt up against the Confederate lines right there, and they get hammered, and they get hung up right there on that slope. Fortunately for the other two regiments in this brigade, the 28th New York is going to wrap around Garnett's smallest battalion, the 1st Virginia Battalion, about 250 guys maybe, and they're going to sweep around up a small ravine and into the backs of the Confederate position. And actually, the 28th is going to swing around and start engaging the 21st Virginia, firing into their backs, bayoneting them before the Virginians know what hit them. They've been having a great time firing out at the Ohioans out there stuck in the field, and all of a sudden they're getting hit from behind. One of the soldiers in the 48th Virginia, I believe it was, said that the situation was like we were mixed up like chickens and ducks. That's how bad it was. This is in the woods. Again, it's 100 degrees in there. And the Federals are trying to exact their revenge for all the problems they've had out in the valley and prior. And so there's atrocities committed in there. There's accounts of wounded Confederates or Confederates who were prisoners that by the time they swept back through, they were dead from bayonet wounds. Happens on both sides during the war. It's actually documented here. It's actually documented here, members of the 21st Virginia. As a matter of fact, there's a poor soldier in the 21st Virginia, a private, who's going to write after the battle that as soon as he got onto the field from marching up from the Baptist church, that he collapsed of sunstroke and was passed out during the entire action. He missed the battle because he was passed out. But because he missed the battle, because he was passed out, he survived. 21st Virginia is going to have the largest amount of casualties from any Confederate regiment in this fight. 3rd Regiment in this fight, God, I hate this button today. There we go. We'll talk about William in a second. 3rd Regiment is the 46th Pennsylvania, and they go busting through, and nobody touches them. Nobody touches them at all. They sweep, as they sweep forward up the ravine, they run into the 10th Virginia, who was coming to reinforce this line and shove them right back. The 10th Virginia, in turn, runs into the 27th Virginia, and they're gone. So a little bit less than half of the 46th Virginia has taken out 2 Confederate regiments before they have a chance to engage. And they're going to spend the rest of their fight, that half of them, fighting over in this part of the field. But the 46th Pennsylvania is going to sweep through those woods, get all the way through these woods down here and engage in the 13th Virginia on the southern part of the battlefield. Again, we have documentation from Early's brigade stating that they're taking fire in their flank and rear. So we know that a portion of the Confederates or the Federals have gotten down behind the Confederate position. It's at this point that Stonewall Jackson is heard to say, there's some serious work going on over there, and is going to race across the battlefield from points down on the far side of the field, get up to the gate area where what's left of Garnett's Virginians have retreated, and begin to rally his men. We'll come back to William. He loses his hat in the ride going across. He grabs a flag and starts to rally his men in the woods there, and he draws his sword. Well, he tries to draw his sword. The sword is rusted in his sheath. He cannot draw his sword. So he's got to unhitch it, flag in one hand, sword in the other, rally my Virginians, rally around Jackson, where's my Stonewall Brigade? The effect was electric. And at that point, things are going to start to change for the Confederates. One of the things that Jackson did, though, was at VMI, before he left, he told his class, war will come in soon, and when it does come, my advice to you is to draw the sword and throw away the scabbard. When the time came for Stonewall Jackson to draw his sword and throw away the scabbard, he couldn't do it. Fortunately for Jackson, Lawrence O'Brien's branches, fresh brigade of North Carolinians are lined up and ready to go. And they're going to start advancing across that field and clearing out all those Federals. The problem is they had to get started first. Branch is a politician, a congressman from North Carolina before the war, did a lot of other things, but his last job was a congressman from North Carolina. And so what's a congressman do to his men before they begin to have they advance? He peps them up. He's giving them a speech, and he's talking to them, and he's getting them wired up. Finally, Jackson has to send one of his staff over there saying, hey, Larry, anytime now, let's go. And he gets them moving forward. And so they start moving forward, and they're going to clear out these woods. By this point of the fight, Crawford's men are beat. They're broken down. There's no formation left in them. And so they're slowly going to be pushed back. One of those men who are pushed back is William Warren. Warren is a lieutenant in the 28th New York. And that's his account that he wrote after the war. So yes, he survives. Bullet in the hand, tip of the finger. Left arm, nearly knocked me down. Not much left of the arm now. Struck in the head and knocked senseless. The side of my face was covered in blood. My eyes were blinded by the shot. I got up and was trying to do what I can. That's 3. He's going across an empty wheat field. Number 4, a mini ball gets him in the neck. It separates the carotid artery from the windpipe because it was a mini ball, so it's rifled, so it's spinning. Talk about a perfect shot. Lodged back in the back of the neck. There was a sharp pain, and then my head began to swell as a big basket. A sharp pain, you think? Finally, he gets a settler, as he calls it, and he gets struck in the left leg above the knee. He falls over, and the wheat shock done for. He's laid out in that wheat field. 5 times he is wounded, doesn't even get across the field. Again, he survived. After the battle, Confederates trying to recover their wounded, go through the bodies of the dead. Hey, you got a nice pair of boots. Come up to him, see he's still alive. Somebody took some pity on him and staked his oilskin cloth, essentially a cover, over him so he can keep the sun off his face. It rains the night after the battle, so now not only is it sun, he's got water to drink. So he's eventually recovered from the battlefield, spent some quality time down in Richmond before he's exchanged. Goes back home, leaves the Army in November. In May of 1863, he re-enlists in the same regiment because the regiment's getting out the following month. It was one of those 2-year regiments. They are mustering out. So he gets out as a member, as a lieutenant with that regiment. Good deal. Is he done with the war? No. That fall, he joins the Army again, another New York regiment, serves out west, gets wounded 2 more times. The guy's a magnet, and he survives. Post-war, he becomes a lawyer, and he dies in Michigan in the early 1900s. So, if he can get wounded 5 times going across the field and go to work tomorrow, you guys need to go to work tomorrow. That's all I'm saying. There's Stonewall again. There's this great quote again. The last attack of the day, again, disjointed throughout the whole day, is George Gordon's attack. And he's got 3 regiments with him, the 3rd Wisconsin, the 27th Indiana, and the 2nd Massachusetts. The 3rd Wisconsin's already been out in this battle once as acting as skirmishers going forward with Crawford. They lost 119 men in 2 minutes. They retreated, formed up with the rest of their regiment and the rest of the brigade, and they're going to come forward again. Originally, Banks didn't know exactly where Gordon was. He thought he was on line, ready to go. He was actually on the other side of Crawford Hill, protecting that flank. So these poor guys have to come up over the hill, through the trees, down into this valley, and sweep across, and they're going to try and support Crawford. Unfortunately, just like the timing is everything for these guys, they show up late. Ronald's Stonewall Brigade finally arrives on the battlefield, and then 2 other brigades show up to support this. So by the time Gordon's men are coming across those 3 regiments, there's Ronald's Stonewall Brigade firing into their flanks. Archer's Mixed Brigade of Georgia and Tennesseans and Alabamans are firing into their front. And Dorsey Pender's going to show up and fire at them in what's reported 3 rods away. A rod is about 16 and a half yards. 50 yards away, they are firing into their flank. These guys have absolutely no chance. And to make it worse, that's where they're advancing across. Stonewall Brigade's up on this high ground. Archer's men are over here. Pender's behind them. They're going through this low ground out here on the battlefield today. This is all open ground. It's called a brushy field because it hadn't been in crop for a couple of years. So you get the brambles and the little cedars and probably wood, gopher holes out there. It was impossible for them to cross. These guys had no chance. They had no chance. The 3rd Wisconsin went across twice. That's what they did. One of the men in the Stonewall Brigade this day was their colonel, but he wasn't their colonel. John Francis Neff had been arrested by Charles Winder because Winder wanted him to do something, but at that time, Neff was working on a court-martial board for Stonewall Jackson. I'm working for the boss. I don't care. I want you to do this. Too bad. You can't. I can't do this. So he puts him under arrest. So on the 9th of August, Neff advances in the ranks with his men, without sword, without pistol, without rifle. He is there standing and supporting his men. That's the kind of guy I want to follow in the combat down the road. Unfortunately, he's only got 2 weeks to live, and he's going to be killed at Bronner's farm at Second Manassas. But he's going to advance with his men unarmed. It's at this point, between Jackson's rallying and Branch moving forward, Ronald and Pender finally showing up on the battlefield, that the Federals realize their day is lost. Prince's men and Geary's men start to withdraw off the field early, and Thomas's men start surging forward. Eventually, Furneaux and Trimble's men are going to come down off that hill and assault the Federal right flank. Banks realizes he's got to get his men off the field in some kind of semblance of order. These guys only know one way to get off the field, and that's the road they came in on, the old Orange Courthouse, Culpeper Courthouse Road, which is still there today. To delay them, he sends forward the 10th Maine. 10th Maine advances towards the setting sun and starts initiating fire with elements of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different Confederate brigades just to buy time. And they're going to lose nearly 200 men out there in that field. They just line up out there trying to slow down the assault. They finally start falling back. The last guys, unused guys on the field are 160 men under a man named Major Richard Falls of the 1st Pennsylvania Cavalry. And Banks says, you go forward. So 160 guys on horses go charging down the Culpeper Road into that. And how's that work out for them? 61 answer the rolls that night. So 100 men are missing on the night of August 9th. Most of those guys will actually make it back into the regiment. They lose about 40, 45, I believe. I can't remember the number right offhand. 39, there we go. They lose 39, but the men are scattered throughout the whole battlefield, and they can't be recovered. Banks's men make their way off the field. It's a Confederate victory. Commissary Banks is struck again. I love this guy. Colonel James Tate is a regimental commander in the 1st District of Columbia Infantry. Who knew the District of Columbia had infantry regiments fighting in the Civil War to begin with? So that's pretty cool. He becomes the brigade commander of George Sears Green's brigade, those guys out on the far left of the Federal line that didn't do anything during the fight. Because Augur and Prince and Geary are wounded or captured, Green becomes the division commander. And so Tate is the next man up. And he does a credible job. He does a credible job out there. He brings the brigade off the field at the end of the night. But what's cool about this guy is what happens after the Battle of Cedar Mountain. In October, he's going to resign his commission, and he's going to become the Provost Marshal, Defenses south of the Potomac, which means he's the cop for around Alexandria, the Army cop for around Alexandria. On February 27, 1863, he is going to be arrested and convicted of 2 charges, neglect of duty and disobedience of orders by a court-martial. Well, how'd this happen? On Valentine's Day, he issues a pass to a gentleman by the name of W.A. Stewart to transport 4 trunks containing articles of merchandise, not contraband, which have been examined. Tate signs this document. I've looked in these trunks. We're good to go. Well, somebody else looked in those trunks. In those trunks were found to contain about 4,000 packs of playing cards. Now, playing cards back in the day had to have a tax stamp on them. So these didn't have tax stamps. So Tate is convicted. Lincoln reviews the court-martial and says, oh yeah, this guy's got to go. But by that time, Tate has resigned out of the Army, and he can't be touched. He's going to live till 1895, serve in various D.C. offices, including the Board of Commissioners, and he's going to be a Justice of the Peace. Not bad for a guy who's letting illegal playing cards go through the lines. Late in the night, it's a moonlit night, it's full moon. The Confederates chase the Federals, and we face them back past Cedar Run Church and onto a piece of high ground out into the open there. There's only 2 brigades left in Jackson's command that are fresh. That's under Charles Field and Leroy Stafford. Dorsey Pender's going to follow along. And Willie Preegham's going to bring his guns along too. And the goal is to keep pressing the Federals and see if we can break them totally. Well, Pegram gets out there in that moonlight and he sees the movement out there and he starts firing at them about 10 o'clock at night. The problem is that there's 4 federal batteries out there and it's kind of easy to see where you're firing from when those flames come out of the cannon. And those 4 batteries respond. And according to the Confederate reports, the firing lasted for an hour. All the Federals say about 15 minutes. And I think it was probably closer to 15 minutes. The next morning, what we have is dead horses, destroyed caissons, dead Confederates. 2 days after the battle, Timothy O'Sullivan, a photographer for Thomas Brady, is going to journey south from Culpeper. He was in town during the fight. He took that photo of those guys up in the cupola of the courthouse. He takes the first photo of something dead on a battlefield. And it's here at Cedar Mountain. And it's those horses. I believe there was 11 horses on the battlefield that he found. There was also decapitated heads of 2 lieutenants and a couple broken caissons. But that is the first photo ever taken of something dead on a battlefield. A month later at Antietam, we finally see some photos of dead men. At Cedar Mountain, there were 2 Medal of Honors won. The first was a man by the name of John Yonker from the 12th U.S. Infantry, German immigrant from Ohio. Most of the Medal of Honors that were awarded for the Civil War were probably awarded in the 1890s when people are getting old and they say, I want to recognize what I've done. And so they started writing, these awards started getting written up. The challenge is that you can't write yourself up for an award. That's what John did. He wrote a letter saying, this is what I did during the Battle of Cedar Mountain. And he was accurate, he was right, except you can't write your own award. So he had to find a captain that was still around that saw what he did, and the captain actually wrote it, and eventually he's going to get his Medal of Honor. The other guy, George Corliss, didn't get along with his regimental commander by the name of Chapman. And so George had to wait until Chapman died. And so in the early 1890s, he gets somebody to start writing him up for his award, and he's eventually going to get his award. Matter of fact, he was, for a while, a color bearer for the 5th Connecticut, the second of between 5 and 7. They don't know how many color bearers they had because they lost their flag. But he was up to a half dozen who's going to lose, who's going to be wounded during the fight. We don't have these great ceremonies at the White House back in the 1890s. Just like the government, you got your check in the mail. You got your Medal of Honor in the mail. He's living in New York, and that Medal of Honor shows up, and he opens it up, and he looks at it, and it's pretty cool, and he flips it over. They spelled his name wrong. Robert Gould Shaw, we know him from Glory. He was here at Cedar Mountain. He's a member of the 2nd Massachusetts. He was not with his regiment. He was working at the division that day, kind of like an orderly or a staff rider, riding around delivering orders. After the battle, he's going to go out into the field and find his 5 friends, all 5 who are dead on the battlefield. Williams is going to be laid out. I think it's Williams. Well, Richard Carey. Richard Carey had been wounded. He lived for a few hours before he died, but someone put a board under him, put his head on the pillow, had his hands crossed. Said he could have looked at him all day. Gladstone William Williams, Ned Abbott, and Charles Godwin, he said he found on the field, and their bodies were much disfigured. And the last one, Stephen Perkins, was found with his face towards the enemy like he was there for a last stand. All 5, what he did is, with all 5 of those men, he cut a lock of their hair and one of their buttons, purchased coffins for them, and they all were shipped home. Some of the few that were actually shipped home. Most of the dead on this battlefield remained on this battlefield until after the war. The cost, these are the top 5 regiment casualties. You can see on the Federal side, 4 of the 5 are from Crawford's brigade. And the 5 from the Confederate side, 2 are from Garnett's brigade out there at the point, and the other ones are from Tolliver. It's horrendous. The total casualties. Look at the Federal total casualty. 21% of the men engaged on this day became casualties. That now, at Antietam and Gettysburg and other battles, there are thousands more casualties during the fight. But from a perspective of number of casualties compared to those engaged, Cedar Mountain, from a percentage standpoint, is the highest on the East Coast during the Civil War. the highest. Only Stones River in Tennessee and Olustee in Florida are going to have higher numbers. But 1 in 5 who walked on that field from the federal force that day are not going to be there that night. 1 in 5. Yes?
When you say casualty, you mean death?
Killed, wounded, or captured. There's a significant amount of men who are captured. At this stage of the war, a lot of the captured will eventually be exchanged back and fight again. The later the war goes on, they're not. But still, you're out of the game for 3, 4, 5 months until you're exchanged and properly paroled. So it takes time for that process to go through. But you can see the number of casualties out there. The 46th Pennsylvania, the 5th Connecticut, 20th New York, so that's 380 prisoners alone that are captured out in those woods that couldn't get away late in the fight. 2 days after the fight, there's a truce on the battlefield, and they're out there to bury the dead. Jeb Stuart is one of the managers of this truce. George Bayard is a cavalry brigade commander under Pope's army, and he comes out on the field just to check things out and renew a friendship with Jeb Stuart. They knew each other at West Point. They knew each other before the war. And so they're having a good old time talking. And while they're talking, according to this source, during the interview, a wounded Union soldier lying near was groaning and asking for water. "Here, Jeb," said Bayard, using the old-time recollections, making him familiar. "Tossed him the bridle to the rebel officer. 'Hold my horse a minute, will you, till I fetch that poor fellow some water.' Jeb held the bridle. Bayard went to a stream and brought the wounded man some water. As Bayard mounted his horse, Jeb remarked that's the first time he'd ever played orderly to a Union general." Someone else who showed up on this in Culpeper after the battle was Clara Barton. Clara showed up in Culpeper on the 13th. We don't believe she ever made it down to the battlefield, but we know she went around in town. A doctor by the name of James Dunn would write his wife lauding Barton's help in supplying surgeons with the needs. As he said, "I thought if heaven had ever sent out a homely angel, she must be one, for her assistance was so timely." Well, he didn't expect that letter to make it into the papers. It showed up in the papers, and so everybody knew that Clara Barton was a homely angel. What Clara did is she found that article, and when they went into her office spaces after she passed, they saw that article pinned to the wall, and homely crossed out, and heavenly put in its place. What's interesting is, you can see that drawing down there. I found a newspaper article from early 1900 from a man named A.J. Parker, who was in the 2nd Massachusetts. He lost his arm at Cedar Mountain and was at St. Stephen's Church. Allegedly, according to this article, Clara Barton walked in with fresh bread, and he was the first guy she met. And he recounted this to her story in the late 1880s, and she remembered the incident. And so Parker has a claim that he is the first person that Clara Barton ever ministered to. Culpeper was, after the battle, nothing but hospitals. From the medical records in their reports, all those buildings on the left and the white there were mentioned as hospitals. Every house was a hospital. That quote up there, a little tough to see. "The wounded were brought in from the fields to the field hospitals on hand stretchers, the ambulances being employed in conveying them thence to Culpeper, and from that point they were sent by railroad to Alexandria and Washington. The number carried from the field under my direction were about 750. That's from one of the surgeons. George Townsend, our friend from earlier in the fight, was going to write. He spent the night at the Virginia Hotel. When he woke up the next morning, when I rose, the porch was covered with wounded people, picking my way among them, the prostrate figures. I resorted to a pump in the rear of the tavern for the purpose of bathing my face. A soldier stood there on guard and refused to give me a draught of water. The wounded needed every drop, he said, and there was but few wells in town. I strolled down the main street, now crowded with unfortunates, and pausing at the courthouse, found the seat of justice transmuted into the headquarters for surgeons where amputations were being performed. By continuing by the street to the left, I came to the depot, and here the ambulances were gathered with scores of inmates. The tavern, continuous to the railway, was also a hospital. The whole town was a hospital. This area was a field hospital. There were men lying out in the street right out where our cars were parked tonight. It was bad here. And it got worse because in a little more than a week later, the Confederates are going to enter town, and those who could not get away became prisoners of war. One of the most interesting stories I found about this is the 28th New York. They lost their flag to the 5th Virginia at Cedar Mountain. Fortunately, one of the prisoners from the 28th saw that flag that night while it was being removed and was able to cut out a piece of it, who he gave to the surviving commander, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Brown. In 1882, Brown is walking through the War Department, the Hall of Flags, the flags they got back from Richmond after the war, and he looks at this flag, and he kind of holds it up, and he pulls out that patch that he has, and he said, "That's my flag." He walks into the boss's office and says, "I want my flag back. It's my flag." They say, "Sure, okay, fine, you can have it." So he takes it home. He takes it back up to New York, to Lockport, New York area, which is outside of Buffalo. Then what he does is really interesting. He writes a letter to the 5th Virginia Regimental Association and says, "We're having our annual meeting next May. Why don't you come on up?" So the 5th Virginia guys get this around the first of the year, and they say, "Well, this is different. What do you want to do?" "Well, let's go." And so in May, 150 Confederate veterans, dignitaries and guests, actually 83 veterans, so the rest dignitaries and guests, take the train up from the valley to Niagara Falls. Brown gets on the train a couple stops before Niagara Falls and hands that flag back to the Confederates. The following day at the annual meeting, a one-legged Confederate major returns an American flag to a one-armed Union lieutenant colonel. I cannot find evidence of a blue-gray reunion before that date. I believe this is the first time blue and gray got together in some kind of formal setting. The following year, the 28th holds their annual meeting in Stanton. After doing their thing, they tour the valley, they go down to Natural Bridge, they tour an asylum. The relationship holds until 1902 at least, when they gather here, cross the train tracks, and dedicate the New York Monument at the National Cemetery, and they go on the next day out into the battlefield and dedicate the 28th New York Monument out there. And they actually dedicate a little monument at the church, Cedar Mountain Church at the base of the mountain, also to a Confederate. First time blue-gray got together from Cedar Mountain. Almost done. Judge Daniel Grimsley in 1901 approaches the Culpeper Board of Supervisors and says, "I want $1,500. What I want to do with that is I want to put monuments on Cedar Mountain Battlefield, Brandy Station Battlefield, Kelly's Ford, and Morton's Ford." Board says, "Okay, here's your money." So he takes that as seed money. He writes letters in all the national publications, invites the veterans to come to Cedar Mountain on August 1901. They come out here. They meet at Cedar Run Baptist Church. They have chicken. They have. I'm sure they have lots of cakes, and I'm sure there's nice speeches and poetry read. After that's all done, they get on their horses and they ride around the battlefield. And the 5th Connecticut says, "We were here." Put a stake in the ground. 28th Virginia says, "We were here," and they put stuff in the ground. This is where Charles Winder was killed. They put out eventually up to 63 markers. And then when they're all done, Grimsley goes, "Okay, I need $5 from everybody, please. I need that admission, I need that subscription to pay for this." And he gets it. So eventually, again, 61 markers are in place. We know that at least 22 survive today. 22 survive, and that's pretty cool, because when they're put out in those fields, it's before there's mechanical farm equipment, and so horses can move around them. After the mechanical stuff starts, farmers pick them up and threw them to the side. So we're very lucky to have 22. In addition to those markers, there's 5 regimental markers on the battlefield, 1 on preserved ground, the other 4 are on private property, and the owner is a friend, and that helps a lot. So between those markers, the Grimsley markers, and the UDC marker that's right at that intersection of Critton Lane, in the 1920s and 1930s, Cedar Mountain was the 5th most monumented battlefield in the country, behind Gettysburg, Antietam, Vicksburg, and Chickamauga. We were number 5. There's monuments to the Battle of Cedar Mountain in the National Cemetery. There's 5 there. There's about a dozen named soldiers from Cedar Mountain that we can find in that cemetery. Most of them are unknown. Most are unknown today. And with that, there's a book for sale about the Battle of Cedar Mountain. What a surprise. It's available here at the museum gift shop, and I'll gladly sign if you guys are interested in purchasing. And thank you for listening, and I'll take any questions that you might have. Yes?
So I'm inferring from what you said that the 9,000 federal walked with the 22,000 Confederates because they didn't know they were there.
They saw them forming. They could see some up on the shelf and down along Crittenden Lane and over in the woods. They didn't think they were together, and Banks knew they were coming up on one road. If I can strike them now, I can kind of defeat them in detail and push them right back down the way they came. That was his plan. If the five brigades actually went forward at the same time, maybe it would have worked. If you guys remember, I mentioned Ricketts' division at Colvin's Tavern. There's a whole division of Federal infantry sitting right there. They bought a ticket. They did not play. Why? Because in 1862, if you show initiative and you get it wrong, you're no longer going to be in charge of anything. And so Ricketts wasn't going to move without orders, and he didn't move until the end of the fight. And these guys watched everyone marching by. They can hear what's going on. A lot of ifs. A lot of ifs. You know, I firmly believe that if Henry got the orders right and Banks just sat up there and waited, Jackson couldn't attack, because by the time he got everybody up in line, it would have been too late in the day. And then the following day, Sigel would have finally showed up. And that would have tipped the balance strongly in the Federal favor. And we never would have had a Battle of Cedar Mountain, and I wouldn't be here tonight. So thank you, Henry Palouse. I like that guy. Other questions? No stingers? Come on, give me a stinger, Brad.
I'm not a stinger, but I do know the story about Snowden Andrews in Germany.
Okay.
It's kind of funny. I just read it not long ago, but he was there with another colleague, I guess looking at munitions and cannon and things, and he requested to go on the battlefield, and the general told him, the Prussian army, you'll need permission from the prince. I forget who the prince was, but it was a German prince, so his colleague went to meet with the prince, which was hard enough in itself, to try to get permission so they could go on the battlefield. Well, Andrew stayed behind, and he had dinner with this group of Prussian generals, and they were trying to insult him. And they said, you're awful young to be a colonel. And he says, I guess it's lucky, you know, you probably didn't see any battles. And he said, well, actually, I was in several battles. And then this old crusty baron said, well, at least you weren't wounded in any of the battles. And he said, well, actually, on the contrary, I was wounded quite badly. So they were all surprised, and these guys were trying to embarrass him, but they couldn't. So I guess after the dinner, the wife said, let me see your wound. And he went into another adjacent room, and he pulled off his shirt, and he had this plate. And she screamed. And I said, my husband has to see this, so she ran and got him. Now the end of the story is his colleague came back, and Snowden Andrews was sitting on the veranda of the hotel, drinking a claret and smoking a cigar. He says, I'm sorry I failed to see the prince. We don't have permission to go on the battle. Just don't worry, I took care of it.
Just think if we had social media back in the day. That would be great. Yes?
Do you know whether that plate was put in when he was lying in our dining room, or if that was a later thing once he parted?
Probably not originally. Probably when he's originally, he stayed there a long time, didn't he? A number of months. Yeah. So I would almost say yes, just because of the length of time he was there. First, they're going to stitch him up and get to the point where he's stable, to the point where they can have further operations and probably put that plate in place. I don't know where that took place.
We read said that when he piled his intestines back in, he packed them in with dirt
With the grit, yeah.
Grit, and that, they had to clean all
Yeah.
that out of it.
Right. But what that did, though, is it helped coagulate the blood and kept everything in place. So modern medical practice, it wasn't, but it worked. It worked for Snowden Andrews. I know. I wouldn't want to think about this after dinner. You're a nurse, friend. You wouldn't want to deal with that, would you? You'd say you're dead. Nice knowing you.
I've been in the operating.
There you go.
Literally, the first doctor to look at him, field doctor, said, I'm not gonna waste my time on this guy, he's a goner.
Exactly.
And he had to have someone go to Jackson, and Jackson then told him.
Take care of
To the Garnet
Yep.
house.
Yep. Guy's name is Amos, as in Amosville, Virginia, was the doctor. And his house still stands in Sperryville. Probably.
Who's the doctor that said he wasn't gonna work on him?
He was one of the Amos doctors. He was one of the Amoses, yeah. Says that he was one of the first doctors on the scene. Yes.
I'm really fascinated by the quality of the photographs. And they were well prepared.
What is so cool about period photographs, and this is not a really good example, is it's a wet plate process. I've given lectures on Civil War photography, and there's a shot from the fall of 1863 of the U.S. Christian Commission tent, and inside that tent you can see there's a desk, and inside that desk you can see there's like a little shelf area up there with little pukas, little holes, and you can see the religious tracts in those holes. You can see which holes have tracts in there. You can't read them, but the detail is phenomenal from Civil War photography. You can blow it up to such a level. Library of Congress website, type in Civil War, and then just, if you want to look at an image, it's cool, you can download multi-meg TIFFs, and the detail and the clarity is phenomenal. We lost that in the early 1900s up till whenever we started getting digital photography. We had those little dot photographs we had in the papers, and when you try to blow those up, it's just a mess.
Their equipment was big.
It was. I don't have a photo. He had O'Sullivan, our other photographers, had a big camera. They traveled with him. Had to have that wet plate, and a lot of times this camera actually had two lenses, so he can make a stereo view, so he can make a view in depth. A lot of these photos that were taken are stereo photos, and so after you immediately took that photograph, you exposed that image, you had to go to his wagon and develop that image before the emulsions went bad, and the emulsions were very toxic at this time also. It took a good photographer could take maybe a dozen images a day. That's all. That's how long this process took. And if you look on some of those photos, you can actually see the photographer's wagon in the shot. Because when they set up that stereo shot, they wanted something here in the foreground, something in the middle ground, and something in the back to bring out that stereo view from that photo. So it's just great to look at some of this stuff.
I have put some of the Cedar Mountain battlefield photos on the Cedar Mountain website, Friends of Cedar Mountain, and I zoomed in, cropped in, and I cleaned them up. And then in a couple instances, I've actually merged the two stereo visions to get a little bit of a bigger feel. But they're fun to look at if you want to check them out.
I keep thinking of the communications and how bad the communications were, and I didn't get the message or whatever. And you compare it to have a phone today, right here, that can call anywhere.
Yeah, but you still get the message wrong sometimes. That's the thing. That's the thing. I saw someone on a Facebook post today that said, my ancestors were able to travel the sea guided by the stars. I get lost using my GPS. I miss my exit. I'm General Banks. I send a message to General Gordon or General Williams, who's got to go to General Gordon. I got to ride my horse or have someone ride my horse, find him, give him the message. The message has got to be endorsed and sent down to the next guy down the line. It takes time. When I talked about the 3rd Wisconsin advancing with Crawford's men, they were 15 minutes, up to 15 minutes behind Crawford because of the time saying they had to go back to their commander and say, hey, can we go play? Can we go charging across this field? And the word came back, yes. 15 minutes cost them 120 men. 120 men. Yes?
Prior to the battle.
Okay.
And prior to the Union seeing Jackson and his crew, what was Pope's marching orders? What was his main objective?
So Pope's main objective, Pope had a couple objectives. Protect Washington. Protect the entrance to the Shenandoah Valley. But his goal in July, late July, early August 1862 was to maneuver down towards Richmond, take Gordonsville, threaten Charlottesville, but threaten the back door of Richmond, because at this point, Lincoln is through with McClellan at Harrison's Landing, and he wants him to leave. And he's ordered McClellan a number of times to vacate the premises and come back north. He still hasn't done it. So this is the final attempt, really, from a Lincoln standpoint, to threaten Lee from the rear to give Pope a chance to get away without any kind of serious damage.
Had Jackson not been there, he would have moved on to Gordonsville.
He would have taken Gordonsville, cut the railroad, and then he would have had that choice to, do I threaten Charlottesville and point south, which would have caused problems, or come into the back door of Richmond and force Lee to turn around and move his men to the other side of town. So either way, it would have been a problem if Jackson was not in Louisa Courthouse and then moved on to Gordonsville and Orange.
Didn't he actually order a cavalry reconnaissance under Hatch to try and take the railroad before the...
Pope's orders in July of 1862, among other things, for his cavalry commanders was to range out, figure out where everybody is, cause some mischief if he can. John Hatch was the cavalry commander under 2nd Corps, Nathaniel Banks. I think it was Banks. Twice he is sent out on raids. First time he kind of runs into some forces and falls back. The second time he kind of heads down Modern 29 near Standardsville and kind of hangs a right and tries to go to Orange and Gordonsville area. He runs into some pickets, some skirmishers, a couple dozen guys at best. He's got nearly a brigade of cavalry. What's John Hatch do? He turns around. He goes back to 29. He continues to the mountains, over the mountains into the Shenandoah Valley before heading north again. When he gets back to Sperryville, when he gets home, he finds out he's got orders. You're now in the infantry and you're in Fredericksburg. John Buford takes command. So there's a couple times that Hatch actually tries to make these raids in there, very unsuccessful. On the other hand, George Bayard, who's going to lose his life at Fredericksburg in December, is brilliant operating in Madison and Orange and I'm missing one. Culpeper County, good grief, Culpeper. They're scouting the roads. They're figuring out where the Confederates are. They're getting numbers, and they're preparing maps for Pope so he knows how to advance when the time comes. He knows what roads work. He knows what fords are going to work. He knows where the houses are along the way. So yeah, John Hatch kind of messed it up for himself, but it worked out all right because he won a Medal of Honor at Antietam. So you know. Anything else? Well, all right. Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed tonight, and I hope this first live. Nobody get COVID. Hope this first live one works for everybody's sake.